I have the great honor and pleasure to be with Maha today, and really been looking forward to this conversation tremendously. Maha, I would love for you to introduce yourself to folks who may have not heard of you or know you, and we can go from there.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to join you today. I'm calling from London, where I've been working remotely the past few months. As you know, I've been a professor for many years at NYU's graduate program in international relations, and over the last year, at least pre-pandemic, I was busy promoting my first book on global risk, which I'll just quickly show.
Yep. Yep.
And it captures a lot of the risks that we were faced with even before the pandemic. So it's been interesting to see how some of those risks have actually evolved during this sensitive period of the global pandemic.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for making the time. Very, very much an honor to be with you. And you know, as we've sort of explored the experience at this juncture of where we are, and especially your focus on risk and many facets, would love to hear kind of your thoughts around what we're experiencing, where you see us going, and kind of what perspective you can offer.
Sure, I'm happy to share ideas. Well, I think it's safe to say the last few months have been an important time to reflect on where we are and whether we are really achieving the optimal, what is best for us geopolitically, politically, economically, and socially. And as I said earlier, even before the pandemic, we were at a sensitive global turning point. And I think COVID-19 has in some ways put the spotlight on these sensitivities and even worsened some of the risks that we were dealing with. And from my perspective as a global risk specialist, I think there are four key areas that we need to keep track of. As we as global citizens try to make sense of the world and where we may be headed, we need to recognize the sensitivities first in terms of our geopolitics. I think everyone is aware, everyone who's watching this is aware that the world order has evolved in recent years. And the truth is that was the case even before President Trump took office. There was a lot of debate and speculation about who's in charge of the world order. And that's a major risk geopolitically that we haven't really come to terms with. Pre-COVID, we talked about US versus China being the major dynamic that's playing out in front of us, and every other country simply had to adjust. But the pandemic has reminded us that the post-Cold War era, driven by US-led multilateralism, is frankly behind us. We have not had any, sadly, not had any global leadership or a sense of unity in terms of state-led actors and our world leaders to have a unified response to the pandemic. And I think that is very troubling. Of course, we've seen that the G20 and the G7 have had discussions. We know that a handful of countries, excluding the US, have committed billions of dollars for a vaccine. But at the same time, we've also witnessed this unique form of bilateralism that has surfaced, what you might call COVID-19 bilateralism, where certain countries have seized this opportunity to build alliances or renew strategic alliances. And I'm sure you're aware there's been so much coverage about how China has tried to take a greater role in the world to fill the gap in global leadership. They've sent medical support to all regions of the world, frankly. But the reality is other countries, Turkey, for instance, has sent supplies related to COVID-19 support to over 40 countries. Cuba has sent doctors to various parts of Europe to offer their support. It's really a unique form of bilateralism that I'm not sure we fully appreciate. Will this specific form of alliance, the bilateral COVID-19 bilateral alliance, reshape geopolitics going into 2021? That's what we need to watch. I think the only real game changer would be if one country creates a vaccine and then decides, you know what, we're going to share it with the world. I think that would really reshape our world order. You know, if China were to come up with the vaccine and offer it relatively cheaply or even freely to other parts of the world, I think we would certainly have to have another debate about who's in charge of the world order. Of course, there's also concern about vaccine nationalism. If one country gets it and doesn't want to
Hmm.
offer it, we could have a significant competition that can add to our geopolitical risks going into 2021. So I think that is what we really need to watch. I also think it's interesting to have observed that these bilateral alliances are not just state to state. You could argue that we're seeing the rise or the resurfacing of non-state actors. I've been talking about this for a few years now. Sometimes I face a bit of backlash about talking about the significant role that tech billionaires are playing in our world order. Even before COVID-19, they were advising the world and other governments about how we're going to lose our jobs to automation. They were talking about UBI and so forth. But now with the pandemic, we see certain billionaires like Jack Ma, Adrian Chang, Bill Gates are directly offering world leaders and countries medical support. So you have non-state to state alliances that are rebuilding or taking shape. How will that change the very nature of power and of the world order going into 2021? I'll be honest, I don't know. But I think this is a trend that we need to observe and keep track of. All of us as global citizens who are concerned about what could be next. So that would be my first global risk relating to geopolitics. Secondly, I think it's safe to say that political risk is significant as well. Again, before COVID-19, the last few years, post-Arab Spring, we've seen citizen-led protests against governments in both democracies and non-democracies in pretty much every part of the world. And I'm not sure why this has happened, except that at the very least, we can agree that tech has empowered a lot of citizens to be more activist, to challenge their leaders, their political systems. In many ways, 2019 was the year of the protester globally. But it led to these larger debates about, is democracy still the best system? We've been having that debate for a couple of years now, and we've even seen major academic studies highlight, shockingly, how the younger generation doesn't seem to care as much about having democracy. It's not as high on their priority list. So this is a concern. Is democracy the best system, or could there be something more in terms of our political development? Is there another stage to our political development beyond democracy? That is a sensitive issue we had pre-COVID-19. Then the pandemic happens, and again, we see that citizens are challenging their governments. Obviously, right now, they're more focused on the issue of race, which I'll talk about. But before that, we saw in countries like India, Iraq, the UK, the US, citizens protesting about government policy relating to COVID-19. There's frustration about, of course, the lockdown measures. There's been frustration growing about the proposed contact tracing, how that will infringe on our individual rights. And of course, in certain countries like Hungary, Philippines, this has been an opportunity for leaders to become more autocratic. You see non-state actors with negative intentions, criminal terrorist groups, filling that policy gap where governments have fallen short. So again, I think the pandemic has exacerbated the existing political risks that most governments were faced with, where you have a legitimacy crisis. Citizens are not really seeing governments as necessarily being the actor that can get us through this. Even if in the early weeks, I must admit, I was hanging on the word of Boris Johnson here, and also hanging on the word of President Trump, hoping that they would, be able to navigate this global pandemic. And as time has gone on, we've all gotten frustrated. So I think, again, political risk, this crisis of political legitimacy, that is something that as we get deeper into the pandemic and hopefully get out of it, we're going to see citizens frustrated, asking, questioning government, did you do enough? Are you providing us with enough support after the pandemic? I think there's more frustration to come. And my students and I at NYU, we do a project annually with this crowdsourced consultancy that I've done a lot of work with over the years called Wikistrat. And we predict every year the global risks that we should expect for the coming year, and we work on this with their crowd of experts. And in January, we released our top 10 list, and we talked about a global spring, how maybe 2019 was the year of the protester, but we anticipated a notable rise in protests for anti-government protests for 2020. Of course, we had a bit of a lull because of the pandemic, but I feel like this trend is going to continue as the world comes out of this pandemic, and look for more of these anti-government movements to be brewing in 2021. And I would really hope that we would have more discussions about whether there's a need for us to reimagine the social contract with that sensitive relationship between citizen and government, because clearly something is not working, whether it's a democratic, a non-democratic, or something in between, a political system. Something is not working. So maybe the pandemic can be the push we need to reimagine our state-society relations. Thirdly, economically, of course, we all know that pre-pandemic, we were talking a lot about the threat to globalization from economic nationalism, populism. We also kept hearing about how many of us in the next 15 years, perhaps 40% of us in the next 15 years would lose our jobs because of automation, right? And according to one, very vocal tech billionaire, Jack Ma, it would create more pain than happiness in the next 30 years. So we were already headed for some more economic frustration that was going to continue to bubble up in certain countries. And now, of course, we have the pandemic that has created an environment in which there's so much uncertainty. It's difficult to know who to believe, but whether it's the IMF or well-known economists, the truth is we're heading into the worst recession in recent memory, perhaps the worst since the Great Depression. And that already is added stress for us. But if you look at the individual, there's going to be frustration about whether government's relief packages, which are significant in most countries, is that really going to help everybody? Or are some people going to be left behind? And I always highlight the term created by this economist, Guy Standing. And he talked about, even before the pandemic, for many years, he referred to this global class of people who have been left behind, okay? They have no occupational identity or narrative to give to their lives, to quote his book. And they've simply fallen through the cracks. Maybe they've been left behind by globalization or the global youth unemployment crisis of previous years. Some were maybe on track to lose their jobs to robots anyway. And now we have the pandemic. And I think there needs to be more discussion about the psychological toll that many of us are going to have to deal with, having lost our jobs or having felt that we're not benefiting from these existing relief packages. So I guess economic risk across the board in the world, we should be concerned about that growing class of people. Who is going to look after them if governments fall short, if their massive relief packages don't deliver? I think that will be a significant source of frustration that can add to this idea of a global spring. Okay, and lastly, and I think this is a risk, social risk, that in many ways I feel has been brewing for many years, but sadly has not gotten any real attention from our world leaders, and that has to do with this idea that we've had this fractured identity where we were sort of pushed into a corner to answer this question for ourselves. Are you a globalist or are you nationalist? Because many of our policymakers and obviously certain hate groups around the world have kind of pushed us into a corner and said, pick one or the other. You can't be both. And we've seen this rise in recent years, pre-pandemic, of hate groups and the evolution of extremism from Islamist extremism to Hindu extremism to Buddhist extremism to far-right extremism, which is very prevalent here in Europe and also in the US. And I think we haven't really seen a clear counter narrative to the hate, at least not from our governments, from our world leaders. The only example I can ever highlight, frankly, is that of Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand, who, after the Christchurch attacks last year, the far-right attack, she handled it beautifully within her country, but also globally called for an anti-racism, anti-hate campaign. But then, of course, we have this pandemic now, and you've already seen that these existing strains have been worsened and created new ones, where you have more frustration in some populations against the other. Some of the examples I've read about recently are, campaigns, misinformation campaigns relating to the virus, but targeting a specific minority, the Muslims in India, Rohingya refugees in Malaysia. We've sadly seen a backlash against East Asians in many parts of the world because of, the fact that the virus appears to have started in China. And I think that, again, I ask, where is the public counter narrative to such hate? And there's been rhetoric in recent weeks from the head of the UN, Secretary General Antonio Guterres, against hate speech, and that is important. But and we've also seen movements led by citizens. There's one in particular I want to highlight, which is the One Shared World movement for global interdependence that has emerged after the pandemic started. And I think that's very positive that citizens around the world are trying to rally together to remind us we do have a global community. And you have nonprofits like Global Citizen launching campaigns about uniting for our future. This is positive. More recently, as you know, we've sadly seen this wave of violence and related protests about race, right? That have been triggered by the the death of George Floyd. And I have to say, this could be the silver lining of the pandemic. Although we did have these movements led by people about uniting around, the pandemic, and there was, excuse me, there was still a lack of dialogue about the hate. And the fact that not just citizens in every US state, but citizens in over 40 countries in the last 2 to 3 weeks have come out onto the streets despite a global pandemic to protest against what has happened, and called for more dialogue on racism, and how they want to show our world leaders that this is an important shared global value. Frankly, I think that's remarkable. I was talking about this with my students when I was teaching a few days ago, that would we still have seen this global response, this global citizen-led call against racism, if there wasn't a pandemic? And I wonder, because I think in a way it's the silver lining that it happened during this period when we were relatively less distracted because we're just focused on COVID-19. Perhaps that is big picture, the silver lining. And I guess the challenge will be to see if this sentiment against racism can translate into sustained policy change. I'm not convinced that our world leaders, frankly, will be able to really give or deliver on anti-racism policies that many protesters are demanding, given the global health crisis. But I think it's encouraging that citizens are so engaged, and particularly youth are so are involved in these protests. That's positive. So what we need to watch for as the global pandemic hopefully comes to an end this year, and as we get into 2021, we have to see to what extent COVID-19 related xenophobia has reduced. We have to see to what extent this movement around anti-racism is actually going to lead to some material change, particularly if we continue to see governments overburdened and unable to really tackle this issue. So that's my view of the world today and where we could be headed. Largely, sadly, not so positive. But I think, again, the silver lining is these identity issues that we've been needing to have a dialogue about on a global scale are being discussed. And I think that's positive. And I think as global citizens, we need to think about what do we want our world order to look like going into 2021 as we, as I said, hopefully, fingers crossed, emerge out of the pandemic? And what role can we play as individuals, right? Because I think to sit back and hope that governments figure it out, I think that's unrealistic. And this is, at the end of the day, the era of more activist behavior by citizens, and that can be positive for us. So that's what I have to say about the world today. Yeah.
I always appreciate your vantage point, because it is truly global and you integrate so many facets together in a very eloquent delivery. So all around, thank you so much for sharing that, Maha. I deeply appreciated. So the question that I have, kind of almost two parts, and then definitely would love to hear your thinking around it. Is the global spring manifesting? Are we rethinking our social contract? Are we reinventing our civilization all around? And specifically, if we look at that piece of it, what is your guidance for us as individuals, and what do you see our role to be?
That's a big question. That's a good question and a big one. I want to say that I want to be optimistic and say that, yes, we are talking about all these issues that are becoming more apparent because of the pandemic. But I just don't see at this stage that this dialogue is going to happen at the level of the state, at the level of government. Okay, I hope I'm wrong. I hope tomorrow every world leader talks about, the identity issues and the related mental health crisis relating to work, etc. I really hope that's the case. But I think at the very least, as individuals in our communities around the world, we can sit and take time to reflect on what do we want. Clearly, as I said earlier, the political systems as they exist today are not delivering what perhaps we feel we deserve. Something is not working. So it would be remarkable if we could have more dialogue about what we expect of our governments going forward into 2021. How can we redesign or reimagine our social contract? I think without a dialogue on that, we shouldn't expect anything more than what we have, and we should expect more citizen frustration that can evolve into a more pronounced global spring. I think the other point we need to reflect on in terms of the political space is that the political systems are evolving. We know that in most political contexts, the citizen is something, the tech-armed citizen cannot be ignored, right? And that's something that has to be factored in to the social contract. We also know that in many parts of the world, and some people take issue when I say this, there is a growing role being played by the activist billionaire. I mean, just look at the pandemic period. There have been so many tech billionaires in particular that have not just been charitable, but tried to, talk about policy, point us in the direction of where we may be headed. And I understand the backlash against tech firms, and we can't ignore that. But is it possible that part of our evolving political order will involve first, an acknowledgement of the tech-armed citizen who is more engaged, who is more activist, but also involves the billionaire or the tech billionaire in some capacity. I also want to say, and that if you look around the world today, the countries that were most effective in handling the crisis have been countries which have happened to have leaders who are women. It could just be a happy coincidence, but perhaps it's time for us to have more dialogue about getting more women into the political space. This COVID-19 pandemic can be a way to push forward. Another idea that I'm developing in my next book, so it's the sequel to Future World Order, and it's called The COVID-19 Effect. How is COVID-19 affecting these different facets of global risk? Perhaps it's in order to help cope with this ongoing legitimacy crisis involving governments and the pandemic, maybe we need to look for some sort of COVID-19 ministry or department that's dedicated to handling, the long-term consequences of what we'll be dealing with. So I don't know if I've directly answered your question, because the point is we need to have we need to have this dialogue about what do we expect going forward of our political systems. But at this stage, I just don't see a conversation happening with our governments, right? We're
Hmm.
going to be spending a few more months at least questioning them. Did they do enough for us? You know? So that would be my response to that. I'm forgetting the second part of your question.
Really, the role of the individual and what we can do.
Yeah, I think, like I said, the global protests regarding race are important. I think that should continue. But I also think I think there's also a need to think about the idea of what is our role in society if our work was already going to evolve in the coming years because of automation, everything is going towards tech. Is it time to start to think about how we need to reimagine our relationship with our work? Do we need to reflect on a new moral economy where we adjust or readjust what we expect of our governments in terms of our basics, at the minimum, what we expect in terms of our existence, our subsistence economically? I think that will be important. But to make sure we're talking more directly about this emergent class of precariats, people who are who were already falling through the cracks, and now presumably that group will grow as some people do not benefit necessarily from the relief packages, and if maybe sadly not everyone will be able to go back to the job they had before the pandemic. It's just the reality. I think we need to have more dialogue about that. Again, ideally, government should be leading the charge, but it's a tough time to be in government. I think
Yeah.
it's safe to say. I mean, there's been a lot of dialogue in the past about how if we want to boost the global economy, we should have more women in the workforce. Again, this could be our opportunity to make sure that happens globally. Uh, and I want to be optimistic, but again, if we can't look to our governments to do this for us, then maybe it's time for us to just, we have no choice to take more responsibility.
Very well said, as always. And I echo, if you will, my experience, respectfully, has been that female leaders do have a distinctive ability to see through some of the noise and to lead in a general way. So my experience is congruent with exactly what you're putting on the table and you're sharing with us. So I definitely appreciate that. And I can't wait for your next book. Very honest, I'm really looking forward to that. So thank you for
I
mentioning that.
No, no, not at all. And oh, I forgot to mention that I'll be giving 50% of the profits to the WHO. They have this COVID-19 Solidarity Response Fund. And after I read about how certain countries were going to cut their funding, I thought, this is my contribution to help people make sense of the world. And if I do sell a few books, I'll look forward to giving 50% of the profits to them, to the WHO.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I know we've taken a lot of your time. I've got one sort of last question, and would love to hear your voice on this. If Maha, if you could be very direct with global leaders everywhere, what is the one message that you would really like them to hear from you?
There's so many issues that we're dealing with related to the pandemic. So it's I think it would be hard to pinpoint one, but I guess if I had to, I think they need to be more aware of the psychological toll that the pandemic has taken on us and will continue, right? And it's going to extend not just in terms of, we've been under lockdown for so many months and, it's a struggle, but the fact that some of us will have to deal with the fact that we're not going to be maybe in the same career, the same job, the same pay scale because of what's happened. And again, it adds to our stress. I think governments need to be talking more about that, because if you have a lot of people who are, going through this mental health crisis, if you will, and you don't see support from your government, there's a risk of negative actors coming in and filling that gap, and that big picture is not good for our political, our political development. if we really lose full faith, if more of us lose faith in our leaders and our political structures, I think the long-term effect is definitely going to be heightened risk. And you know, the usual suspects who'd like to fill the gap, right? Depending on the political context, whether it's an extremist group or a hate group, or and so forth. So I think that would be the mental health, the related mental health crisis, I think needs to be dealt with more explicitly. Whether that happens is a separate issue. And a lot of what I've said, I mean, a lot could change. Well, not a lot, but some of what I've said could change if there's a change in leadership in the US, right? The sensitivities around global leadership, the issues regarding the role of the US in the world, etc. If there is a change in leadership, maybe things will get better, but I don't think we should assume that if suddenly Biden wins the election, that everything will snap back into place. We still have a lot of work to do either way. So,
and it's great to know that we have voices like yours in the conversation that can offer perspective and guidance and wisdom. So definitively, Maha, and you know how much I appreciate you and what have you. You're most welcome. I love the emphasis very specifically. There's dialogue that needs to happen. There's conversations that need to manifest. There's awareness of the mental health issues, and really we shouldn't rationalize what COVID has done and has had us experience. And definitely, I love the way you said it. If we lose faith, then the risks proportionally exactly go up. So by all means, I want to thank you again, Maha, for the time, and truly your presence in the world is needed, and we're very grateful for it. So thank you so much for making the time.
No, I appreciate it so much. Thank you for reaching out to me. I hope you know, your listeners will enjoy what we've talked about, and they're welcome to reach out if they want to have a dialogue. I'll be very, very open, and stay safe. Everyone should wear a mask, right? We got to worry about the second wave now in most parts of the world. So just take care.
Thank you, Maha.
Thank you.